Well, a couple weeks ago, we passed the 106th anniversary of the Titanic disaster a few hundred miles off the United States East Coast. Since this probably is not your first day on planet Earth, I'm going to assume that you know the basics of the whole story. A major antagonist in the whole saga is obviously the iceberg. If not for that big old chunk of frozen water, the Titanic name would very likely mean virtually nothing to a vast majority of us. Many of the Titanic's contemporary ships wound up being destroyed by German U-boats during the First World War, and maybe that would have been the much less grandiose fate of the Titanic herself as well. Or maybe she would have been unceremoniously scrapped a few decades later when air transport took over. We'll never know, and it's all because of the iceberg. But immediately following the sinking, nobody cared about the stupid iceberg. The Titanic wreck was the third largest maritime loss of life in recorded history at the time, and it was by far the most notorious due to the long list of Edwardian aristocracy on board and the fact that it was the largest ship in the world. But as the shock over the enormous loss of life faded away, researchers started digging into the details. And they're still digging today, 100 years later. But even now, nobody's entirely sure how the evil iceberg looked. Most icebergs in the area were photographed in the days after the disaster by looky-loos and crews aboard recovery vessels, but a majority of those are pretty easy to cross off the list. Except two. After all these years, two icebergs have emerged as the most likely cause of more than 1,500 deaths. Suspect number 1. This iceberg was photographed from a ship named the Prinz Adalbert, in the general area of the Titanic sinking only a few hours after the ship disappeared. At the time, the chief steward on the Adalbert had no idea that the Titanic had sunk. He was simply taking an interesting picture of an iceberg in a part of the ocean that only 1 to 4% of large bergs reach before they melt. In his note that accompanied the photo, he mentioned that there was a clear streak of red paint near the iceberg's waterline. Interestingly enough, the Titanic was painted bright red below its own waterline. Reports from the Titanic survivors claim that the ship had sheared off a significant amount of ice from the berg, so it's quite reasonable to imagine that the iceberg had rolled very slightly due to a changing center of mass from the collision, which exposed the red smear that had been a few feet underwater. For many years, the red paint was considered to be the smoking gun, and the case was more or less closed. Even today, many people still believe that there's nothing left to discuss. That's the iceberg that did it, and it's the end of the story. But there are 3 problems. The first problem is that it's the wrong shape. Several accounts from Titanic survivors claim that the iceberg roughly resembled the legendary Rock of Gibraltar. The Adalbert iceberg isn't even close, even when you consider perspective. The second problem is that there's no collision damage. Yes, it's true that the iceberg probably outweighed the Titanic by at least a factor of 10, but the ship did weigh 46,000 tons and it was moving at around 20 knots. That's going to leave a mark, and there doesn't appear to be any. The third problem is that icebergs are known to have colored streaks from marine biology or pollution. It's not exactly a common thing, but it's also not unprecedented. The picture is just too grainy to really see if the streak of color was actually paint. Although the chief steward didn't know about the Titanic disaster when he took the picture, he did know about it by the time he wrote the following photo description. On one side, red paint was plainly visible, which has the appearance of having been made by the scraping of a vessel on the iceberg. Was he looking for something that just wasn't there? Suspect number 2. This iceberg was photographed by a man named Stefan Rohorik aboard a ship named the Bremen. The photo was taken on April 20th, which was 5 full days after the Titanic sunk, but still in the same general area. Icebergs naturally drift around 13 kilometers per day, so anything within about 70 kilometers south-ish of the wreck site is still a very plausible candidate. In his description alongside the photo, Rohorik said, "I also saw the bodies of the drowned and the wreckage from the ship. It was a dreadful sight." His words seemed to indicate that the berg he photographed had indeed been drifting in the same general direction as the other remnants of the disaster. The Rohorik photo sat around for more than 80 years before being closely examined by a German journalist named Henning Pfeiffer in 2000. Since then, it's raised a lot of eyebrows among those who were convinced that the Adalbert iceberg was to blame. For one big thing, there's clear damage. A whole corner of the berg had been sheared away. Pieces of iceberg do collapse all the time during the melting process, so it isn't any kind of definitive proof that the Titanic inflicted the damage. But the North Atlantic had been unusually cold during the spring of 1912, and it would have been strange to see a large berg collapsing by mid-April. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, is the shape. It's got the same vague saddle shape as the Rock of Gibraltar that many survivors reported. So there you have the 2 prime suspects. What do you think? Are either one of those icebergs clearly responsible for sending the mighty Titanic to its grave in roughly 12,500 feet of icy North Atlantic water? Or will the debate rage on for another 100 years? In my opinion, the Rohorik iceberg is clearly the stronger candidate. I just have a hard time believing that 46,000 tons of steel could only leave a smear of red paint. In either case, the iceberg didn't survive long enough to face the music. After needing roughly 15,000 years to grow from gradually accumulating and compressing snow on Greenland, and an estimated 3 years of floating south into the Titanic's path, the iceberg was likely melted to nothing in the Gulf Stream by the beginning of June in 1912. A simple patch of fresh water in an endless ocean, and very soon after that, no evidence at all. It was the perfect crime. If you like this video, I strongly recommend that you pass it around to literally every human being you've ever met, and some animals. Or just like and subscribe for more from the WildAC channel. Thanks for watching.